Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat at the Library Company of Philadelphia. Tonight's event is The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History with Dr. Michael D. Hattem. My name is Fran Dolan. I'm the Director of Operations for the Library Company, and I'm excited and pleased to welcome you all to tonight's event. If this is your first Fireside Chat, or if it's a returning one for you, the event's kind of the same. It's a chance for us to put a spotlight on research and fellows that have come out of the Library Company over the years, kind of really get into the core of what the Library Company does. The Library Company of Philadelphia is an independent research library concentrating on American society and culture from the 17th through the 19th century. Free and open to the public, the Library Company houses an extensive non-circulating collection of rare books, manuscripts, broadsides, ephemera, prints, photographs, and works of art. Our mission is to foster scholarship in and increase public understanding of American history before 1900 by preserving and interpreting the value materials in our care. The Library Company connects with thousands of visitors annually, ensuring that the lessons of the past will continue to amaze, instruct, and inspire future generations. We serve a diverse constituency throughout Philadelphia and the nation, offering comprehensive reader services, an internationally renowned fellowship program, online catalogs, and regular exhibitions and public programs. The Library Company regularly presents exhibits, lectures, symposia, conferences, gallery talks, and other programs in order to make the collections accessible to the widest possible audience. Exhibitions highlight various strengths of our collection in engaging ways. Program topics range widely, and most of our events are free and open to the public, but we do appreciate when you register ahead of time. It helps us manage space. For details on upcoming events, you can see the events section of our website. That's librarycompany.org. Additionally, many of our exhibitions are available online. So much of what the Library Company does is free, whether it's public programs, whether it's research being done in the archives, and so much of that is due to the shareholding program that we have. Shareholders at the Library Company support the institution, they stay really connected to it, and they own a unique piece of the Library Company's history. You get a numbered share as a shareholder. You can learn all about the history of it. And then our archivist will do an excellent job matching you up with some previous owners who share some of your interests or a connection to the Library Company. It is really an interesting program, and it is so essential to the work of the Library Company and lets us continue on all of the great stuff that we do. Another great way to support the Library Company is our upcoming annual dinner, which is being held on October 28th this year. And again, you check out our website, librarycompany.org, for more information about that. During tonight's event, you can submit questions to the Q&A function on the bottom of your Zoom. Dr. Michael D. Hattem is an American historian with interest in early America, the American Revolution, and historical memory. In addition to The Memory of 76, Yale University Press, 2024, he has also written Past and Prologue, Politics and Memory in the American Revolution, Yale University Press, 2020. His work has been featured or mentioned in the New York Times, Time Magazine, the Smithsonian Magazine, the Washington Post, as well as many others. He currently serves as the Associate Director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. Dr. Hattem was a Library Company 2016-2017 Robert J. McNeil Jr. Fellow. Welcome to the Library Company and the Fireside Chat, Dr. Hattem. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Fran. It's great to be here. So I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Library Company for hosting this event. And I'm going to start with a story that I first came across in the archives of the Maine Historical Society about a decade ago. This is Eliza Wadsworth. She's a 20-year-old woman who lived at home with her family in Portland, Maine, what would become Maine, at the turn of the 19th century. And in January of 1800, having been so moved by the recent death of George Washington, she asked her father, Peleg, who had been a former Continental Army officer and who was then serving in Congress in Philadelphia, for a memento of the Revolutionary hero. And so Peleg wrote to Martha Washington to ask for something on behalf of his daughter. And the former First Lady obliged by sending a lock of Washington's hair. Shortly after, Eliza received a package in the mail, and inside were two envelopes, one marked "Read this first." And in that envelope, a letter from Peleg wrote, "You expressed a strong wish for some relic of General Washington." And then he said, "I will not detain you longer, but leave you to unfold the secret." Eliza reacted by asking, "How shall I duly honor this relic? I feel as if it was too great for me to possess," she wrote. "And I want to give thousands who have never had the happiness of seeing General Washington the satisfaction of viewing this lock. I am singularly happy." But her health was unstable, and just 2 years later, she was dying from tuberculosis at the age of 22 when she drafted a note about her most prized possession. And she wrote, "The hair of General Washington I leave in the care of my sister Zilpa, and I wish it may be preserved in our own family while it can be safe." She died on August 1st, 1802, and her letters and the lock of hair were preserved within the family. And her sister later passed them down to her son, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, who ultimately donated them to the Maine Historical Society, where they remain today. Now, Eliza's story is about more than just a young woman and a lock of hair. It's emblematic of the deeply emotional connection to the memory of the Revolution that Americans began to forge in the early 19th century, and that really has continued generation after generation throughout American history. My new book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History, uncovers the long and surprising history of how the Revolution has been remembered and depicted in our political discourse and our popular culture, how the meanings we've attributed to it have changed over time, and the many conflicts that we've had over remembering the Revolution and defining its legacy for nearly 250 years. But rather than try to summarize those many changes and conflicts that the book covers, I'm going to use my talk tonight to explore this sort of broader and more fundamental question of why we as a nation, like Eliza Wadsworth, have had this unusual emotional connection to the Revolution, and why our memory of it has played such a unique role in American life for more than 2 centuries. And to do that, I'm going to talk about the importance of how we tell the story of the Revolution, when we tell the story of the Revolution, why we tell it, and what we remember from it. Now, the memory of the American Revolution is our national origin myth. And because of this, it has had an enduring hold on the national imagination. Now, historians typically use the term myth to mean a widely remembered but inaccurate story. But the primary definition of a myth, particularly an origin myth, is to explain how a society or a people came to be and to define their character and their principles. So to mythologize the Revolution is not really to tell an inaccurate or exaggerated story about it, but rather to tell its story to explain how the United States came to be and to try to define the American character and ideals. And in this talk, I want to really explore what it actually means that we have mythologized the Revolution, how that's worked, and what it tells us about Americans' historical relationship to their founding. Now, like ancient peoples created mythologies to explain how the natural world worked, we have mythologized the Revolution to explain how the nation works. Ancient myths about the origins of city-states and empires played a crucial role in defining what it meant to be a Roman or an Athenian or a Spartan. And these stories were passed down through generations in poetry and in prose, represented visually in civic buildings and everyday items, and commemorated in civic and religious rituals. And often there were multiple competing versions of these myths because they changed over time as circumstances changed, and because new tellings would emphasize different aspects of the stories. And the same has been the case for the popular memory of the Revolution. Now, like so many good stories, the tale of the American Revolution has essentially been told in 3 acts. The first act has tended to focus on the coming of the revolution. It features a succession of familiar legislation and events like the Stamp Act, Townsend Acts, the Boston Massacre, the Boston Tea Party, the Coercive Acts, the formation of the Continental Congress, right? Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, the failure of the Olive Branch Petition, and the declaring of independence. The second act has really featured the war and is structured around a timeline of major battles, right? Like Quebec and Brooklyn, Trenton, Saratoga, the winter at Valley Forge, Brandywine, Monmouth, Yorktown, and countless other smaller events in local memories. And the third and final act recounts how in the 1780s, the weakness of the Articles of Confederation led to the Constitutional Convention and ultimately the culmination of the revolution with the Constitution's ratification and the passage of the Bill of Rights. And so this story has a logical beginning, middle, and end. And this traditional story structure has really imbued the telling of the revolution with both a literary quality and for some a sense of conclusion. But if we go a bit deeper, the way that Americans have told this basic story of the revolution has followed a familiar form. The hero's journey is a common narrative structure in Western mythology, first identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid-20th century. And put simply, it's a sequence of commonly recurring plot points that he found in his studies of many hero myths, including those of Jesus, Moses, Muhammad, various classical Greek and Roman gods. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, this structure has been used by writers and filmmakers, many of whom were explicitly influenced by Campbell's work, in such iconic products of popular culture as Star Wars, The Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, and others. And how Americans have told the story of the revolution for nearly 250 years, I want to suggest has roughly followed this traditional Western mythic narrative structure. So at the start of the hero's journey, or the hero, or in our case, the revolutionary generation, receives a call to adventure, right? And after a number of attempts in the 1760s by the British Empire to exert greater control over the colonies, in 1774, Parliament passed the infamous Coercive Acts in retaliation for the Boston Tea Party. And this unprecedented attack on colonial self-government caused colonists to create a Continental Congress. And what typically happens is that the hero then resists the call to adventure. Throughout 1774 and 75, Congress refuses to consider independence and instead is focused on trying to reconcile with Britain. But eventually the hero accepts the call and sets off on the adventure by crossing the threshold into the unknown world in Campbell's terms. In July of 1776, of course, the revolutionaries accept the call to adventure by declaring independence and crossing the threshold into the unknown world of independence and war. The hero then undergoes a series of trials and temptations, right? And for the revolution, these trials are represented by many of the war's battles. And though they're rooted in actual history, some of the war's most famous stories feature in their retelling mythical themes or near mythological scenarios. If we think about the Continental Army's daring escape after the Battle of Brooklyn, right? So the story goes, the army was penned in along the East River by the British Army, and Washington engineers the crossing of his entire army in one night under cover of darkness and thanks to an opportune fog, thereby avoiding a likely early end to the war. Similarly, there is the successful attack on Trenton on Christmas Day, 1776, which is mythically depicted in Emanuel Litz's famous 1851 painting. This is when Washington crosses the Delaware with his ragtag army in the middle of the night and scores an important victory against the feared Hessians mere days before the army's enlistments were to end. Now, such tales have really lent themselves well to the mythologizing of the revolution and of the founders in popular memory. And though the stories are rooted in actual historical events, they've been told and retold in ways that lend them mythical connotations, right? Including telling them as though they represented direct interventions by God. And this has tended to lend a sort of a predestined or even providential nature to the nation's origin myth. Now, often early in the journey, the hero receives guidance from a mentor and later receives the timely aid of a helper. For the revolutionaries, the mentor, we could say, was Franklin, and the helper was certainly France, right? And like the many times in mythical stories and folk tales, when the helper shows up at just the right moment to make victory possible, the French fleet arrived at the Chesapeake Bay from the Caribbean just in time to surround Cornwallis's British army and make the siege of Yorktown in 1781 possible. And that effectively ends the war and secures American independence. Now, as a result of the adventure, the hero often undergoes a process of revelation and rebirth. And in our story, the revelation of having secured independence leads the former British subjects to be reborn as American citizens. And the hero then typically experiences a process of transformation, followed by atonement on their road back to the known world. And for the Americans, this happened after the war as they quickly come to realize that the government created by the Articles is not working, and they call a constitutional convention in 1787. And then the final act of the journey is when they receive the gift of the goddess, right? And for the revolution, that is the Constitution. And so in the end, the hero returns to the known world, which is now changed for the better thanks to the hero or heroes having undertaken their adventure and the illuminating revelations or first principles that they bring back with them. Now, because of its prevalence and its longevity in Western culture, the hero's journey as a narrative form feels familiar to us, even without being explicit. The mythical, literary, and religious traditions of the West really have sort of culturally hardwired us in such a way that this story structure elicits intense emotional responses, and not least because hero myths were part of ancient religions and civic histories. And that the story of the revolution has often been told like this, I think, helps us better understand Americans' unusual emotional connection to the revolution. Such stories kindle intense emotional connections, in part because they're usually intended to foster one's sense of belonging to a community. And after all, Americans have long identified with a cast of unlikely underdogs who become larger-than-life heroes by surviving a series of trials and achieving a seemingly providential victory against all odds over the evil empire, right? And there's a real civic power that comes from people collectively imagining themselves as the descendants of heroes who achieved the impossible. Many generations of Americans who have encountered this narrative of the revolution, particularly in their youth, have had emotional experiences, I would argue, akin to those that modern audiences have had to Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings or Harry Potter. And the fact that these were actual historical events and figures from the recently recorded past didn't stop them from becoming mythologized, even as soon as the early decades of the 19th century. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't point out that this mythologizing of the revolution and of the founders has often relied on parts of the story being intentionally excluded from the traditional narrative, notably the importance of slavery, treatment of indigenous peoples. And that's because they did not fit within the traditional narrative and the meanings that the majority of white Americans have wanted to attribute to the revolution. But yeah, as my book shows, there's been a slow but steady process of expanding the narrative and the people included in the popular memory of the revolution through the efforts of social movements and marginalized groups themselves staking claims to citizenship and belonging within the nation. I'll say a little bit about that at the end. But all this aside, the kind of mythologizing of the memory of the revolution that I've described has historically provided a nation that is still relatively young uh, with an epic, mythical past, replete with heroes, villains, peril, daring escapes aided by a seemingly enchanted natural world, and meaningful revelations about how the world or the nation should be. And throughout, there's a real sense that good and evil exist, that they're clearly delineated, and most importantly, that the former triumphs over the latter. It is a myth of both the end of an earlier age and the beginning of a new age, and a sort of national genesis. And by casting Americans as both its heralds and its heirs, the mythic nature of the popular memory of the revolution has lent a weight laden with meaning, purpose, and destiny to the American identity for more than 2 centuries. And this is, in no small part, why the revolution has been so central to our politics, culture, and national identity for the last 250 years. Understanding the form in which the story has often been told offers some insight into why Americans have developed such an emotional connection to their origin story, and their sense of the exceptional nature of their origins. Now, there's actually a field of study known as fandom studies that explores how people and groups relate to such stories and other facets of popular culture, how they express their unusual emotional connections to them, and even more, how those connections influence their personal identities and lead them to form communities with their fellow fans. One of the most common ways that they do these things is through conventions, annual events where people who share a love of these stories or a specific story gather to discuss and express their connections to them. Americans do the same for the American Revolution every July 4th. And every time they visit places like Mount Vernon, Independence Hall, the Boston Freedom Trail, or countless other local historical museums and sites. Another way that fan culture expresses an emotional connection to stories is by engaging in cosplay, right? Where attendees dress up as their favorite characters. And of course, Americans have a long tradition of reenacting in full costume Revolutionary War battles or moments like the crossing of the Delaware. We also see this in our political culture. If we only look back recently to the Tea Party rallies of the 2010s, where some attendees would dress in colonial or revolutionary style clothing. Still another way that these emotional connections to stories are expressed is through fan fiction. There are whole websites devoted to fans writing their own stories that feature the characters of Star Wars or Harry Potter or countless others. This one website here has 637,000 stories just on this website alone. And Americans have done this too by creating and reading historical fiction, that is, stories set in the Revolutionary era and often featuring real life characters. Johnny Tremain is a classic example of that. A fourth way that people engaged with these stories in fan culture is through fan art or creating artwork that depicts famous scenes from the stories. And Trumbull and Lutz, anyone. And though this is not a comprehensive list, a final way I'll mention is that fans strengthen their connection to these stories through visiting recreations of the world of those stories. Fans of Harry Potter can visit the Universal Studios theme park and walk down Diagon Alley, while Lord of the Rings fans can go to New Zealand and visit the preserved set of Hobbiton. There's a Star Wars theme park at Disney. People visit them because they want to inhabit the stories that they love and the characters that they have such a connection to, because it strengthens their connection to them and to the community. And this is the same reason many people have long visited places like Colonial Williamsburg or the Boston Freedom Trail or Independence National Historical Park. So we can see that many of the ways that Americans have celebrated or commemorated the revolution have some similarity to the similar expressions in these fan cultures. And those fan cultures are created when stories take hold of people's imaginations and they establish such deep emotional connections to these stories that they go on to form a part of their personal identity and a shared community. After all, nations are in no small part held together by the stories they tell about themselves and their origins. And in that sense, nations are as much a literary creation as they are a political creation. I'm not expressly arguing that nationalism is a form of civic fandom, or that modern fandom has its roots in nationalism, but I think the similarities suggest something even more elemental about how we as humans relate to mythologized stories and the effects that they have on us. And also how we as citizens relate to mythologized origin stories and its effects. And I would argue that that effect is intensified for the memory of the revolution, primarily because it is an origin myth told often in the form of a hero myth, and it's through origin stories that nations define themselves. But the study of the popular memory of the revolution is not just about how we tell the story. It's also, and maybe even more importantly, about when we tell the story. And this is what the bulk of my book does. It looks at how the memory of the revolution has changed over time, how Americans have fought over its meaning and legacy, and how the context of the present has always shaped how we remember the revolution. And so I'd like to tell you another story that shows the importance of when the revolution is remembered. This is Robert Goldstein. He was born to parents of German descent in San Francisco. He was a Jewish American costumer in Los Angeles in the 1910s. And he'd also been a small investor in D.W. Griffith's 1915 blockbuster film about the Civil War, The Birth of a Nation. That film's success convinced Goldstein that a similar large-scale historical epic film about the American Revolution could be just as popular, if not more so. And so he set about raising a large amount of funding for what would become the first full-length feature film about the American Revolution, with the intent of writing, directing, and producing this film, despite having little to no experience with the movie industry, but beyond his costume shop. His film was called The Spirit of 76, and it promised, as you can see here in the poster, a historical romance dealing with the American Revolution and its causes. Goldstein debuted his film in Chicago in May of 1917, 1 month after the U.S. had officially joined the war against Germany on behalf of its new ally, Great Britain. Now, throughout the 19th century, Great Britain had played the role of evil villain in the popular memory of the revolution. But with the Great Rapprochement, relations between the two countries became more friendly around the turn of the 20th century. And in attendance at a required pre-screening in Chicago were some critics and the city's controversial police censor board. Now, one of the critics wrote that the film, quote, inspires patriotism and should cause the red blood of any American to tingle. But the head of the censor board was a man named Major Metellus Lucullus Cicero Funkhauser, and he disagreed. He objected to scenes that showed British atrocities, including one scene where a British soldier ransacks an American house and sticks his bayonet through a supposedly occupied baby's crib. And another showed a British soldier assaulting a young American woman. These scenes, he said, would, quote, arouse bitterness and sectional feeling against England, now one of the United States' allies in the present war. And so Funkhauser seized the film and called the Justice Department. Eventually, Goldstein was allowed to show it so long as he deleted the offending scenes, which he did. Now, we don't know why, but before the film premiered proper in Los Angeles in November of 1917, Goldstein restored the deleted scenes. He was arrested immediately after it was shown and charged under the Espionage Act, which had been passed just a few months earlier to crack down on public dissent against the war. His bail was set at $10,000. The LA Daily Times ran the headline, War of Revolution Film Seized by Government. And you can see the reels of the film being seized here. The case went to trial, and it was presided over, kid you not, by Judge Benjamin Franklin Bledsoe, who agreed that the film would, quote, arouse our revenge and question the good faith of our ally, Great Britain. The trial began in the spring of 1918, and some people believe that Goldstein was a German agent. Others believe that he was a quote unquote bumptious ignoramus who is more fool than villain. Newspapers reporting on the trial called the film German propaganda, impure and simple. And they included in stories about the trial news about unrelated arrests of people accused of spying for Germany at the end of news stories about the trial. Goldstein was found guilty and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and a $5,000 fine. Thanks to a post-war review of prosecutions under the Espionage Act, Goldstein was released early in 1921, and after an unsuccessful effort to revive the film, he disappears from the public record. It seems that he left the US for Europe in search of work, and he next turns up in Nazi Germany in 1935 when he was arrested for being unable to afford to renew his passport. And there's some soft evidence that suggests he may have been deported by Germany and returned to the US. But either way, this story is an example of how the politics of the times shaped the ways that we remember the revolution. Goldstein thought he was making a patriotic film that was based on the memory of the revolution that he had learned when he was younger, in which Britain was the evil enemy. And his story is also a reminder of the great power of the memory of the revolution that we learn when we are young, and of how difficult it can be to let that memory go as we get older and newer memories of the revolution emerge. In some sense, Goldstein's great tragedy is that he was too slow to realize that the memory of the revolution was changing rapidly because of the war, and that the old memory had not only become outdated, but legally treasonous. If he had released the film a few years earlier or a few years later, things would have likely turned out very differently for him. Instead, Goldstein was imprisoned as a traitor for making the first feature film about the American Revolution, which is lost to time because no copy of The Spirit of 76 has ever been found. Now, in addition to the importance of how and when we tell the story, it's equally important to understand why we tell the story of the revolution, why we remember it. And I would argue that the origin of the revolution's hold on the American imagination and its importance in our political culture, in some sense, even predates the revolution, going back to a pre-revolutionary cultural inheritance from Britain. In the 18th century, many British subjects believed that history was cyclical rather than linear. Empires and civilizations rose when their people had a collective hunger for political power and economic prosperity, and that tended to produce virtues of frugality and concern for the public good over the individual. But then once a society achieved power and prosperity, its people tended to become profligate and concerned with their own self-interest over the public good. And that would lead ultimately to their inevitable decline. And believing that this cycle had played out across history, British thinkers in the early 18th century argued that the best way for any society to temporarily forestall its inevitable decline was by recommitting to its quote-unquote first principles. For them and for British colonists in North America, that meant recommitting to the principles of the Glorious Revolution of 1688. But of course, since 1776, Americans have looked for their first principles in their own revolution. And there's been no shortage of first principles to consider: liberty, equality, union, democracy, constitutionalism, republicanism, federalism, capitalism, and others. And the conflicts that Americans have had over the meaning and legacy of the founding for the last 250 years have been in no small part about choosing and defining the most important first principles of the revolution. For example, Americans have rarely agreed on the meaning of terms like liberty and equality. Is the liberty promised by the revolution that of the individual or that of society as a whole? What does equality mean? Is it equality before the law? Is it economic equality? Is it racial equality? In his Gettysburg Address of 1863, Abraham Lincoln defined the Revolution by the Declaration of Independence's two ideals of liberty and equality. And when he gave that speech, he understood those two ideals as being mutually reinforcing. And he could not have predicted that, in no small part because of the Civil War and the end of slavery, those two terms would eventually come to be seen not as reinforcing, but as being in direct opposition to one another, as many Americans would increasingly come to see any attempts to redress inequalities as infringements of their individual liberty. And this is just one example of how, through the memory of the revolution, we not only choose our first principles, but also justify our definitions of them. And whether Americans are aware of it or not, we have inherited and intensified this idea of first principles and the notion that there is a kind of protection in looking back to the founding. And this, too, helps explain Americans' unusual connection to their revolution. And in addition to how, when, and why we remember the revolution, I want to conclude by saying a little bit about how what we remember from the revolution matters. Because its purpose is to define the nation and national identities, many of the fights that Americans have had over attributing different meanings to the revolution have effectively served as a proxy for some of our most long-running political debates and tensions, such as those between liberty and slavery, individualism and the common good, federal versus state power, active government versus limited government, equality and capitalism, citizens and immigrants, religion and secularism, as well as regional conflicts between North and South and East and West. And that's because even within the structures that I've laid out here, Americans have always selectively emphasized or ignored certain parts of the story or certain people to attribute a specific character or meaning to the revolution. And that's what a popular memory is. It's a way of telling or interpreting a story about the past to attribute specific meanings to it. For example, one can easily tell the story of the revolution as a very conservative event led by a few great men that was intended to preserve British liberties. One can just as easily tell the story of the revolution as a very radical democratic event brought about by common people engaging in violent protest and secured by a war won by ordinary soldiers. You could tell the story of the revolution in a way that centers capitalism by stressing the role of British imperial reforms that restricted trade as a motivating factor. You can tell the story of the revolution as a victory for republicanism over monarchy, or of democracy over republicanism. You can tell the story of the revolution as being defined by the principle of federalism, where the revolution culminates with a constitution that limits the state's independence. Or one can tell the story of a revolution in which the popular and state-centered spirit of '76 was betrayed by the counter-revolutionary constitution. The revolution can be a product of high-minded ideals or hypocrisy. It can have resulted in liberty or oppression. And as my book shows, each of these memories of the revolution have been prominent at one time or another throughout American history, often simultaneously. And each of them, even the ones that directly contradict one another, are to some extent, if not equally true, right? But none of them are the whole truth, right? And that's because the revolution was too rich and complex an event, carried out by too diverse an array of peoples, to ever be distilled into a single story or narrative, or to have one single meaning. As Walt Whitman would say, the revolution contains multitudes, and that is a good thing. As a national origin myth, the popular memory of the revolution has always been contested and adopted by Americans across the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, because of its complexity, because of its multitudes. In other words, there's no single correct meaning or interpretation of the revolution, but instead the meanings that we attribute to it reflect our own times and our previously held beliefs. And that's because it has long been part of our birthright and civic identity and civic duty as American citizens to determine what the revolution means to us as individuals and as groups. And my book shows how, for nearly 250 years, we have reimagined the revolution in the context of our own times and according to the first principles that we think are most important. And ultimately, the central importance of the memory of the revolution in American life has really been more than an origin story or a hero myth. or even some supercharged combination of both, but by being constantly revised and reimagined. My book shows how the memory of the revolution has been an important tool, not just for relating to the past, but for making sense of the present and for expressing our vision of the future. And as a result, we have always embedded in our memories of the revolution our grandest dreams and our highest aspirations, as well as our deepest fears and our ugliest prejudices. When Americans look at the revolution, we are effectively looking into a mirror. We define ourselves in part by how we define the revolution. We see ourselves in the revolution, and we see the revolution in ourselves. The revolution is always in the eye of the beholder, and though some may claim sole ownership of its memory and legacy, in a democracy, no one owns the past. And on that note, I will conclude by echoing the words of Eliza Wadsworth's father, Peleg, from 224 years ago, and say that I will not detain you any longer, but leave you to unfold the book's secrets. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Adam. That was super interesting. I really found that genuinely compelling. I think a really interesting approach to all this. So everyone out there, if you've got some questions, please use the Q&A feature to submit them to Dr. Hattem, and we'll go through them. I'm going to get started with a question that I have is, 2 years from now, and it's going to be the 250th anniversary of the country, and there's going to be big celebrations all over the country. Philadelphia in particular is one of, maybe the biggest hub of all of this. How would you like to see kind of the country look back on itself and commemorate it in a big public way? Do you have any thoughts on how we should look back, use our memory, look back, incorporate everything that's happened, what happened then?
Yeah, I mean, I I I expect, I expect that the 250th anniversary of independence will play out a lot like the previous major anniversaries of independence, which I cover in my book. And one of the surprising, maybe surprising, features of the centennial in 1876 and the bicentennial in 1976 is that uh, they often foster more engagement with local history or regional history than they do actually with the history of the revolution, uh, for a variety of reasons at each time. But I suspect that that will be the case this time, and I think that's actually a good thing. I think there's a real challenge to think about this from the perspective of, say, public history professionals, museum professionals, right, who face really significant challenges in how they approach the 250th anniversary. But for society as a whole, I expect that it's going to be much more of the same in terms of uh, people using the revolution to justify and to understand the present. And also point out that, I mean, there are a significant number of similarities between the present and the coming of the bicentennial in 1976. There was, you could say that the bicentennial era essentially started in 1969 with the premiere of 1776 on Broadway, right? So if you could, in some sense, say that the long sesquicentennial era also started with a musical, and with Hamilton in 2015 and
Yeah.
2016, right? In the 1970s, people were experiencing an unprecedented levels of distrust in the government and in public institutions. I think we're seeing that again, right? That's another similarity. So there are many more, I think, but I suspect that the 250 is going to play out in very similar ways to the previous major anniversaries.
Cool. All right, so we got a couple questions coming in. The first one: does the hero's journey inherently overemphasize that the hero, America, succeed mostly or solely on their own merits and play down the aid received from other groups, France, Spain, Netherlands? You did hint at this with respect to Black soldiers and Native Americans. We are minimally taught in schools about the critical aid from these countries.
Yeah. I mean, does it downplay it? In a sense? I mean, it includes, right? I mean, the helper is a key aspect of these stories, right? What is uh, who is Luke Skywalker without Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Who is Frodo without Gandalf? These are so they play a key role, I think, in the story. So I don't think it ignores them necessarily, right? But of course, you know, the point of the hero's journey uh, is to uh, is to tell a story about a hero, right? And I think there's something, you know, there's something to be taken from that, which is that even in this most common of um, uh, mythical hero story structures, you know, that a helper plays you know, typically plays a very important role at key points in the story.
Yeah,
Right?
Lafayette in particular, I think of when you know, he's all. I feel like all the rage these days. You hear a lot about him
Another
making
example. Yeah.
his victory tour. Um, So we got a question from David Rose. David asks, do you feel that a part of the future is individual Americans keeping their own narratives and telling their own stories as they relate to their own ancestors' roles in early American past? Is potential opportunity the use of institutions like the Library Company of Philadelphia to find their own narratives inside of the same 250 plus year span of revolutionary history?
Yeah, that's a great question. The people finding their individual or familial, ancestral relationship to the revolution is in some sense a constant feature of the memory of the revolution, right? That's how we get uh, patriotic societies like Daughters of the American Revolution, the Sons of the American Revolution, in the late 1890s, and there are purposes that those groups serve at that time, but that are distinctly politicized, but they are expressions, much like the colonial revival was, right, about trying to feel a connection to the past, about trying to establish a connection to the past, a meaningful connection to the past. And for some people who, you know, who can trace their ancestral lineage back to the revolution, clearly, you know, that has an important and meaningful uh, uh, impact on their personal identities, right? So, you know, the problem with that is that the emergence of these groups in the 1890s and in the early 20th century tended to create a sense of a hierarchy in terms of citizens' relationship to the revolution, right? That people who had these connections through their ancestors somehow had a deeper connection to the revolution, that or that they had more of a right to interpret the revolution for the rest of their American citizens. And of course, around the turn of the 20th century, that also meant for a growing audience of immigrants. So, you know, that's the kind of thing that plays out both ways, right? Um, I think I think it's always been the case that people have related to stories of individuals, right, more than, you know, some uh, a story that analyzes the ideology of the revolution or whatnot. That's why biographies are so popular, right? And always have been, and why you know, books like Parson Weems' Life of George Washington in the early 19th century proved so popular. Uh, so you know, people will always relate to the revolution in those kinds of ways on the level of individuals. And of course, since the 1970s, since the bicentennial, in some sense, um, it's been no small part of the work of historians to uncover more stories of ordinary people and their contributions to the revolution. And that is something I expect, you know, will continue to be powerful way of establishing emotional connection to the revolution.
Um, so we have another question here. I think this one. Given the way American ideas or myths about being an exceptional republic and democracy have propelled U.S. foreign policy and foreign relations, including a lot of violence wars, Western expansion, and genocide, do you have any misgivings about an argument that seems to say the creation of a national mythology is an inherent good? Yeah, I guess you associate the two.
I don't think that I said that it was inherent good. It is an inherent part of our national history, right? If you read the book, you will see many ways in which the memory of the revolution has been used for uh, nefarious purposes, right? Memory of the revolution is malleable. It can be essentially what you want it to be, what you need it to be. Uh, has it been used? Absolutely, it has been used, especially since the onset of the Cold War. It has been used um, as a way of bolstering a sense of American exceptionalism, particularly originally in relationship to the Soviet Union. And that sense of American exceptionalism has itself had negative consequences. I think memories of revolutions like revolutions themselves often have unintended consequences.
Well, that kind of segues perfectly into our next question from John Peel, actually says, I'd like to hope that the revolution is a bonding American experience. But as you said, differing political ends of the spectrum define it differently. Do you think that studying the revolution and the celebration of our 250 years can be a unifying occasion?
Uh,
And I'm thinking immediately of the graphic you put up that shows far left, far right, everyone celebrating and commemorating in different ways. It's interesting.
the thing of the thing that I have found in working on this book is, despite the fact that I think for a long time, maybe less recently, but for a very long time, there was an underlying assumption uh, about the memory of the revolution that if only more people learned about the memory of the revolution, that it would bring the country together. But my book is fundamentally about conflict, and so what I have found in the last 200 plus years is that the memory of the revolution has often done far more to divide Americans than unite them.
Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, that may be the reality.
It's
Um,
our national origin story, and because it is so malleable and because it serves this purpose of definition, right? Um, uh, it, in some sense, it almost has to be that way.
all right, we have time for a little bit more. Bridget Donahue Farrell asks, or says, I'm working on creating an idea for a monograph on historic cemeteries and public history and memory. Do you have any recommendations on the endeavor of starting the research and writing process?
That's a great question, Bridget. I will have to think more about that, and you should email me so that we can exchange some ideas. I mean, obviously, there's practical things about the process of research and writing, uh, but I actually did not do very much work in this book at all even in just the broader research part with cemeteries and things like that. And obviously, they are very common sites of commemoration. So I would suspect that there's uh, that a lot to be found in a project like that.
Um, so what do we got here? Um, this touches on the earlier question a little bit. So Bell Hickory asks, genealogy is all the rage now because so many records have become easier to find. Does this accessibility also influence how Americans are approaching our history? Are more or fewer primary sources available now? I think that's been interesting. And how will this play out in the future with ever more sophisticated technology. So it's similar to a question before, but I think getting into some different aspects of
Yeah, that's that's a really interesting question. Um, I'm just a historian, so I can't really predict the future. Um, but yeah, absolutely more sources are being made available, and not, I mean, not just typical, genealogical sources like we might think of censuses and things like that. Um, but manuscript sources, many more manuscript sources are being digitized now, and will continue to be. Uh, I think that I think that the future holds out the possibility of being able uh, to learn much more about individuals in the past than probably has been possible up until the advent of the internet and the digitization of these types of sources. And again, that goes to the points that I was making about people making individual connections to the past. That's not just people. It's not just the American Revolution. The American Revolution is not the only historical memory that plays a role in our political culture, right? Obviously, the memory of the Civil War is critically important uh, in our broader national history culture. So, um, you know, uh, the ways as more and more people are able to access and uncover, uh, let's say, genealogical information, the more doors are open for how people will establish connections to the past, whether that's to the revolution or something else.
Yeah, I can definitely see more groups like Daughters of the American Revolution popping up as different immigrant communities and, learn more about ancestors who were just a couple generations removed and the experience
Yeah.
they went through and looking for a connection there. It's be interesting to see how that
The
all.
Daughters of the Lower East Side.
Yeah, I was exactly something like that for sure. It's not a stretch to think of something like that emerging. Um, so we are just about out of time here. I want to thank you again, Dr. Hamm. This was really, really interesting. And thank you again to our audience for joining us here tonight. Our next Fireside Chat coming up is on September 25th. It is called Speculation Nation, Land Mania and Revolutionary American Republic with Dr. Michael Blackman. And September in general is very, very busy with the Library Company. We have a ton of stuff going on. We'd love to see some more programs. We have the opening of Crania Americana, a performance of Project Obtuse at the Asian Arts Initiative. We have a book launch of Tangled Journey, One Family Story and the Making American History by Laurie Ginsberg. You can check all that stuff out at librarycompany.org. Register for some events, learn more about the Library Company. And thanks again, Dr. Hamm. This was really interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Have a good night, everyone. Take care.